Prithvi Shantirantarikshakam Shantir Dyaus Shantir Dishashantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapah Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantirme Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra Sukhinas Santu, Sarve Santu Niramayaha, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschit Dukkha Bhag Bhavet, Sarvastaratu Durgani, Sarvo Bhadrani Pashyatu, Sarvas Sadbuddhimapnotu, Sarvas Sarvatra Nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Shanti 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 Harihi Om. Om Asato ma Satgamaya Tamaso ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Mayedhi Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Our today's topic presents us a choice between self-reliance and self-surrender. It also points to a conflict between these two options, as they obviously look very dramatically opposed to one another. A similar conflict or a choice is presented in different terms as well. Sometimes we hear about the choice between self-effort and God's grace, or even self-effort and predestination. So let us first reflect on each of these two options and see how they fare when they are presented as a choice. First, self-reliance. Now, the case for self-reliance seems obvious when we know that when we are born, we are not self-reliant. In fact, for the first few days or weeks, we don't even have the sense of self. That's what they say. In other words, a baby which is just a day or two old has no idea where its body ends and the rest of the world begins. It just seems like one continuous whole. And at some stage, maybe after a few weeks, the sense begins to develop that I am someone. In fact, a story is told of a professor of psychology at his home when his baby first began to speak and the first uttered the pronoun I. He gave a big party, invited all his friends, because the awareness of I is a profound landmark in our life. Because we are too small then to even recognize it, to realize it. But that's a big step to know that I am someone. Now, that awareness of the self that comes to us after a few days or weeks, there is very little we can do with that self really at that stage. The most that we can do at that self is all that we probably gather intuitively is, if I need something, I just need to yell and shout or cry. And that's pretty much what babies do. It's probably just instinctive that I need something, and then parents, usually the mother, can understand what that cry of the baby means. Whether the baby is hungry, or maybe the baby just wants to fall asleep. So we kind of interpret the baby's cry in our own way, and somehow that seems to be the only language the baby can speak. Somehow there is this awareness that whatever I need, if I make some kind of a sound, it will be fulfilled by the loving presence of these kind people who are around me. And then gradually the baby recognizes, well, there's someone very close to me. And then you say, well, this is my mom, this is my dad. Slowly that awareness comes. Now with age, this awareness of the self, and remember, I'm not talking of somebody else. We all were babies once, so we have all passed through these stages. So with age, this awareness of the self then becomes more pronounced, stronger. And it then usually, when we, in our teenage years, it becomes very rebellious, because my self can become so strong that it may not want to submit to any authority. It may question the authority of one's parents, oftentimes that happens. That's why we say, oh, these are teenagers. Because that's the time the self is trying to assert itself and trying to find its bearing. That where am I? How free am I? And so on. Now, the more we, in the teenage years, try to assert ourselves and try to become free, so to speak, then we are forced to rely on oneself. Earlier, life was easy. Others took care of me. But the assertion of one's freedom comes at a price. And the price is then I become responsible for my own actions, for whatever I do. I have no one to blame at that point. And then that begins then the experience of stress, anxiety, fear come. Alongside, of course, there is the joy, the thrill, the excitement of just being my own person, that I can do whatever I want. So there is some thrill, some joy related to that. But there is also the stress and anxiety. So it's a package. Now, in time, this self, which is now trying to become independent, trying to stand on one's own feet, itself gets extended with what it sees as mine. And this can include not only one's material possessions, but also one's talents, one's knowledge, one's skills, also one's friends, family, children. So the self's possessions, everything and everyone I see around me as my own, become kind of my extensions of myself. And the self feels strengthened by it. And sometimes this strength can be elusive, but it feels like strength. I mean, there are people who feel the more friends they have on Facebook or on Twitter, oh, I have so many followers. And so you just kind of feel somehow you're just kind of extension. These are my followers. These people like my posts, although you probably don't even know them. It's just a number or just some vague names. But these are the kind of extensions the self tries to make in order to make itself bigger. Because the bigger I am, the less threatened I may feel. Again, not very true. But generally, the idea is if I'm strong, then I can deal with the difficulties. And so it's ironic, actually. First, we didn't have to worry about anything. Then we become separate and say, I'm someone. Then I say, I'm someone. Then suddenly I'm faced with all these worries, anxiety, stress, and everything. Then I say, well, I'm just too small. Let me make myself bigger. And so we cut ourselves off, and then we try to then build bridges or connect ourselves to the world in order to become big and then somehow acquire that sense of strength. Now, of course, as I said, our children are extensions of ourselves. Now, when the children start growing up, they are also going to pass through the same stages that you and I went through. And of course, first, they will be completely dependent on you. And then when they become teenagers, then they want to assert their freedom. Now, by that time, they've already become extensions of yourself, remember. So when the children try to assert their freedom and become someone, you are a part of those who we saw as our parts are kind of being chopped off from us. And then that can be very painful. And that's the experience many parents and grandparents have had when the younger members of the family begin to assert their freedom. So the separation, the painful pain that we experience is not very different from the pain our parents may have experienced when we were growing up. And so this is how the cycle gets repeated in every generation. Now, something similar happens in the case of spiritual seekers as well. But in their case, their extension of the self has an additional dimension to it because God is somehow in the picture. The spiritual ideal is somewhere in this larger landscape in a spiritual seeker's life. And therefore, self-reliance, in the case of a spiritual seeker, takes also the form of a struggle to realize God, or to go achieve the spiritual ideal, or to have the knowledge of Brahman. So just as we have the need to rely on oneself to fulfill the different goals we have in life, for a spiritual seeker, a spiritual goal is at least one of the many goals. And so that is the additional dimension in the life of a spiritual seeker. Now, there is an ancient Sanskrit saying. It goes like this: Udyamena hi siddhyanti karyani na manorathaihi nahi suptasya simhasya pravishanti mukhe mrugaha. Which means success in work comes through enthusiastic effort, not through dreaming. No animals voluntarily enter the mouth of a sleeping lion. And this is pretty obvious. And we know that in order to achieve anything in life, in order to get anything in life, we can't be just sitting and dreaming about it. We need to put some effort into it. We need to do something about it. Whether we are spiritual seekers or not, we also realize that no matter how much effort we might put into things, how hard we may work, things do not always work out the way we want them to. No matter how hard we struggle. And that's been the experience of many of us at some stage or other in our lives, when many things work out the way we planned them to. But there will be things when they didn't work out. Not because you did anything wrong, not because you didn't work hard. Maybe you did everything that was humanly possible, and yet things didn't turn out the way you thought they would. And therefore we realize self-effort is sometimes not enough. That self-reliance has its limitations. Now, for those who don't believe in God, or don't have any specific interest in spiritual life, the door seems closed at this stage. I mean, what else can you do? You tried your best, you did everything as it ought to be done, and still no results. Not, at least not the kind of results you wanted. And then the only choice is then, well, blame someone about it. Blame your bad luck, blame people, blame circumstances, blame the president, blame the government. You just can't do anything. But we keep on blaming things outside of ourselves because the door seems closed. Now, for spiritual seekers, there is at least one door open. So, well, if things don't work out the way we want them to, in spite of our effort, the spiritual seekers at least have one option, and that is they can pray. They can seek God's grace. Now, prayer is a very powerful practice. It may not always be possible to explain it scientifically. Well, how does prayer, I mean, sometimes people do ask, how does prayer work? And one can try to find some explanation for it. It's never fully satisfactory. And what I sometimes find it helpful is, I don't care how it works. I know that it works. And so long as it works, it really doesn't matter. I mean, think about it this way. All of the gadgets that we use, even your laptops and in your cars, how many of us exactly know how does the whole system work? If we knew it, then we wouldn't need to take it to the store to fix it when things get wrong. But even though we don't know it, we still know that we can get along just fine, so long as it works that I want it to. Prayer is a little bit like that. It just works. And we know it works not simply through theory, but generations of people before, not only people in history, but even our own contemporaries, maybe people and friends you know, who will testify, who will give their personal testimonies that prayer did work in their case. And therefore, a logical thing would be, well, if it worked in the case of other people, there is no reason why it shouldn't in my own case. And just kind of a footnote to that. What does a prayer that works really means. Our general understanding of prayer as a powerful practice would be, I pray for something and I get it. And then it works. I pray for something, I don't get it, well, it doesn't work. That's not quite really what prayer is. Prayer really means that you ask God or your spiritual idea, whichever way you think of a higher power, you ask that higher being or a higher power for something. And then the higher being responds. That's what prayer is. God always answers the prayers. Now, that answer may not always be yes, but no is an answer. Now, again, this explanation won't make any sense. People is like, oh, this is just a kind of a way to explain away things. But for a spiritual seeker who truly believes that there is this higher benevolent presence, and then that presence always listens. They say in some of the ancient texts, God can hear the footfalls of even an ant. So it's very sensitive. So the prayer that we do is not necessarily to inform God what we want. It's really to inform ourselves. It's to kind of let ourselves know what we need, because they say that God knows what we are going to pray even before we have prayed for it. So it's not really for God's information. It's more to clarify our own understanding. In any case, we should be thankful that many of our prayers, probably most of our prayers, are not answered because we really don't know what's good for us. Everything that we feel I need, I probably don't need. Everything that I feel will make me happy will probably not make me happy. And if a devotee sees that God is one's own father, one's own mother, and just as no matter how much our children might ask us for something, and if we know that it's not good for the child, we are not going to give it to them. Not because we don't like them. In fact, not saying a no, a firm no, to a child who is imploring you for something that will make the child unhappy will be an act of love. Because you love your child, you're going to say no for things that you know are not in the child's interest. So even when God does not answer our prayer with a yes, God answers our prayer with a no, that still shows God's great love for us. That's how a devotee thinks. So that brings us to self-surrender. So what is self-surrender? Because a prayer is not possible without a spirit of surrender. Otherwise it just becomes a demand. But you acknowledge your own helplessness in acquiring or getting something. You acknowledge the faith and the power of someone, or God in this case, who can give you what you want. Only then that prayer becomes sincere and prayer becomes natural. We know that ego is necessary in our lives. In fact, all of the work that we do, I think, all of these activities possible only when we have the ego. Now, what kind of an ego we have? Well, one of the common ways that ego gets expressed in all of us is the ego that I'm a human being. Now, the fact that I see myself as a human being gives me a lot of abilities to do the kind of things human beings do. But it also imposes upon me a limitation, because when I see myself as a human being, I'm limiting myself to what this human body and human mind are capable of doing. Because I, for instance, cannot fly like a bird, because my present eye is not the eye of a bird. It's the eye of a human being. But in dreams, we no longer have that limitation. We no longer have the human eye holding us. And that's why it's possible for us to grow wings and fly in dreams. So we see that whatever sense of I we have, to whatever form we attach that I to, we acquire the abilities associated with that form, but we also acquire along with it the limitations attached to that form. Now, if we can, just like we seem to break free from our human limitations, or at least the way we understand human limitations in the waking state, and are able to do things in our dream, not always, but sometimes do things in our dream which we cannot do when we in the waking state. The question is, can I break free from my human ego, the ego that I'm a human being, even in my waking state? And that is what spiritual seekers try to do. So sometimes when we are asked, remember you are the spirit, you are the Atman, or you are a child of God, what we are essentially striving to do is to loosen the hold of that I am a human being. Not that you stop being a human being, but that does not become my dominant identity. The dominant identity would be then, I'm a child of God. The dominant identity would be, I'm a spirit. Sure, there is this human dimension to it, but I'm primarily a spirit. Sri Ramakrishna gives an illustration. Let me read to you his words. On page 174 of his conversation, the Gospel of Ramakrishna, this is what he said. You may try thousands of times, but nothing can be achieved without God's grace. One cannot see God without His grace. Is it an easy thing to receive the grace of God? One must altogether renounce egotism. One cannot see God as long as one feels, I am the doer. Suppose in a family, a man has taken charge of the storeroom. Then if someone asks the master, Sir, will you yourself kindly give me something from the storeroom? The master says to him, there is already someone in the storeroom. What can I do there? What Ramakrishna is saying here is, the I, our ego, has presently taken charge of the storeroom. In other words, has presently taken charge of this body-mind complex, if you like. And as long as the I, this manager of the storeroom, if you like, is controlling it, God will not interfere. Somehow this I has to go. Only then. It's a little bit like, sometimes think about it this way. Let's say the owner of a shop, a small little shop, and he has one employee there. He has employed one person to carry on the daily work of that shop. Now a customer shows up, and this owner is just maybe sitting there or just standing outside, and the customer says, I would like to get this. What the owner says, well, go inside. There's someone who will attend to you. And as long as that person is there, there is no reason for the owner to go and attend to the job himself. Only when, let's say, that person either resigns and walks away, or like their office hours are over, and then if someone shows up, and then the owner will say, okay, I'll take care of it. In the same way, whenever opportunities present themselves in our lives, whenever things need to be done, whenever responsibilities and duties call, there is the ego here already employed, so to speak, self-employed. So God doesn't interfere. God says, well, there's already someone taking care of it. Now that I has to go, only then will we become truly instruments in the hands of God. Now how will this I go away? Krishna in chapter 9 of the Gita, 9:22, and there's this beautiful verse. It goes like this. Ananyas chintayanto mam ye janaha paryupasate tesham nityabhiyuktanam yogakshemam vahamyaham. Which means, to those who continually meditate on God as not different from the self and see God in all beings, I carry what they lack and preserve what they have. So when this I gets out of the way, one of the reasons why we are afraid of the I getting out of the way is that how will even life be possible without I? We see Vivekananda as a young man named Narendra when he first went to Ramakrishna, during one of his earlier visits, once Ramakrishna saw he was this pure-souled young person, and so he was so eager to impart to him that highest wisdom. So he just goes and just with a touch, it completely revolutionizes this young man's mind. And he then, Vivekananda later on described it, he said, all of these distinctions began to disappear. And when everything disappears, it's not that the I stays. The I itself becomes shaky. The I, the sense, the I, we don't realize how powerful the hold of I is on our lives. Sometimes you might see, nowadays anesthesia, etc., is pretty effective. You just don't know when you suddenly lose it. Suppose in anesthesia you were about to lose your I gradually, that could be a very terrifying experience. And so Vivekananda, we see, as he was maybe 19 or 20 years old when he first came to Ramakrishna. And so he just shouted out, "What are you doing to me? I've got my dad and mom at home." So we can see that when the I goes away, everything, it's like pulling the carpet, pulling the rug from under your feet, carpet under your feet. Yeah. So it just feels like that. And therefore, this, the fear of losing that I is very great. So it's easy and theoretically to say, well, don't think of yourself as the body and mind, you are the spirit. Well, that's fine. But when you just try to think about it, how strong is this I? And what this I needs to be preserved. And it's okay to say to those who continually meditate on God, well, first of all, we don't have the capacity to meditate on God all throughout the day. But even if we could, would we want to? Because then there is the question, well, if I don't report to duty, I might lose my job. If I lose my job, who will pay my bills? And therefore, much as I would like to give myself entirely to spiritual life, I cannot because of other compulsions in life. Now, what Krishna is pointing out here is, if that's the real thing that's holding me back from giving myself fully to the spiritual ideal, he says, you need not worry about it. Because if I am completely devoted to the ideal, if my I gets out of the way, then yoga kshemam vaham yaham, I preserve what they have and I bring them what they lack. So the circumstances around us will rearrange themselves in such a way that whatever it is that we need, it'll come to us. Whatever it is of ours that needs to be preserved will be preserved. And that will happen need not necessarily in some kind of a dramatic landing of the spaceship in which God comes and helps us, although nothing is impossible. On the other hand, it doesn't have to be that way. What it means is that things will be taken care of. And we see that in a very dramatic way in life of Ramakrishna himself. That we know he was employed as a priest in the temple of the Divine Mother. He received his salary and so on, just like most people do. But then a stage reached in his life when he was so immersed thinking of the Divine Mother that it was not possible for him to continue the worship. Not because of laziness, not because he didn't like the work. He just couldn't, because his mind was filled with God. Now, think about it this way. If Ramakrishna had then thought, oh, I really love the Divine Mother, but if I really don't do this, carry out my duties, I might lose my job. So better I try to control my enthusiasm for spiritual life, and then we wouldn't all be sitting here today. So such was his enormous spiritual hunger that even this thought of self-preservation, of what will I do, this I completely went away. And then we see that everything that he needed, small things and big things, everything that was necessary just came on its own. And that's what Krishna says. And Ramakrishna didn't say it only happened to him and it won't happen to anybody else. No. Krishna says it'll happen in the life of any and every spiritual seeker. that let's not hold back for fear that if I don't take care of myself, who will? Now, this has to be sincere. This is not, it isn't like, well, if God is going to take care of me, well, that's an easy way out. I don't need to struggle. It doesn't work that way. Only when I strive hard and then I truly realize that this I is the only hurdle that's standing in the way, it's then that it happens. So when we are faced with this dilemma, so we have seen briefly that the two options before us, being self-reliance or self-effort and self-surrender, or depending on God's grace. So if we have this dilemma, what are the kind of things we need to remember? So very briefly, to conclude, some of the important points that we need to remember when we are dealing with this. It's an age-old question. It's not something that you can solve in a 45-minute discussion, because people have tried to grapple with this self-effort and divine grace. What works, what doesn't work, and so there are some important things we need to keep in mind as we try to figure it out in our own lives of how these two forces or two options, what role do they play in our own lives. So first thing is, self-surrender is not as easy as it sounds. There's that little book I sometimes refer to called The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. It's a very inspiring book and very deceptively simple in some ways. When you read that, it's very inspiring, very encouraging, and just feels like, oh, that's so great, so simple. We just have to keep on, do nothing in life, but every moment try to feel God's presence. But only when we truly start practicing it, we realize how tough it is to remember every moment that God is present. In fact, being aware of a divine presence in our lives, every moment of our life, may be a little bit uncomfortable, I imagine. Because we even those of us who see ourselves as religious, spiritual people, having God around all the time with us probably may not be so comforting thought. We want God to be there with us when we are in trouble, that's for sure. But at other times, presence of God might have a dampening effect on all the joys that we seek in life. And so we know, therefore, that self-surrender is not easy. There was this disciple of Ramakrishna named Girish Chandra Ghosh, a great dramatist, very talented person, but was given to a very bohemian sort of life, very dramatically different from what we might say as a very spiritual, religious, oriented life. It was very, very opposed to that. What we might today say very worldly, very materialistic. And somehow he came in touch with Ramakrishna. And Ramakrishna instructed him, and he found that he was incapable. Ramakrishna said, well, couldn't you meditate for these twice a day? And he said, no, my schedule is such, this thing, I just can't do it. And he said, well, at least try to remember. And everything that Ramakrishna asked him to do, even the simpler options he provided, and he said, no, I've tried, but it just doesn't work. I'm not able to do it. And then Ramakrishna said, well, okay, then here is something. Why don't you give me your power of attorney? So that, well, then I take your complete responsibility. Well, that sounds like a great option. Well, I don't have to do anything. My responsibility is taken by him. And so he readily agreed. And then he realized, he was a very sincere soul. And then he realized how tough it is. How easy it was before, that when you could do things, take your own decisions and do it. But once you give your power of attorney, you cannot decide anything on your own. He said, and he was, for instance, he was an alcoholic, he had gambling, he had all kind of vices. And then he said, well, I have given my power of attorney. Every time he started to drink, he said, I can't do it unless I seek his permission.
I can't even think about it unless I seek his permission. And then he gradually realized that giving one's complete responsibility to God is easy to speak about it. But when you actually try to do it, it's a very, very tough thing. It's so much more easy to do things oneself. So self-effort in some ways is an easier option than self-surrender. Now, until our self is not freed from material desires, by material desires I mean desires for things that are perishable, that are transient, it is not possible to let go of the ego. As long as the ego is in search of these perishable entities, it's very strong. So at that stage, we may still seek God's help, but God will be only a means to a goal. And I imagine most people who see themselves as religious are not really seeking God for God's sake. Most of them seek God because if I pray to God, if I worship God, if I become religious, if I try to practice spiritual life, it'll bring me peace, it'll take away my stress, it'll take away all my problems, maybe a long stay or an infinite stay possible in heaven. So all of these things will become possible if I pray to God. So God then is not the goal. God is only a means that will give these other things to me. Now, as long as my goal is somehow to be happy and have fun, and as if possible, everlasting joy, I'm really devoted not to God, I'm really devoted to that joy. And therefore, the way heavens and hells are understood in Vedantic texts, seeking only a heavenly joy and not seeking God for God's sake is a kind of materialism. Is a materialism with a spiritual coating, if you like, a spiritual color. And therefore, in the practice of bhakti yoga, in devotion, they say there are two kinds of devotions. One is devotion with desire. It's called sakama bhakti. And a devotion without desire, a nishkama bhakti. In other words, when I want God because God can give me X, Y, Z things, well, that's good. Rather than finding a worldly solution to a worldly problem, I'm trying to find a spiritual solution to a worldly problem, which is good. But it's still not the highest form of love. The highest form of love is that I love God for God's sake. And even in the other loving relationships that we have besides God, even there we need to ask that the things that I love in life, the people that I love in life, why do I love them? Do I love them for their sake, or I love them because they mean something to me? So even when we love other people because they bring some joy or meaning to my life, I'm really devoted more to myself than to them, because they become only the means to fulfill my life. But the highest form of love would be, I love you because you are you. And in the process, even if I have to suffer, so long as you are happy, I will continue to love you. That would be a higher form of love than I love you because you make me happy. So same psychology works when we think about love for God as well. So all of this devotion with desire, seeing God as a means, not as a goal, can bring us some amount of fulfillment in life. So absolutely. People are religious, it brings some amount of peace, some amount of fulfillment to them. But it can never bring us complete fulfillment, total fulfillment, until I'm able to love the spiritual ideal for the ideal's sake, not because it's just a means to a different goal. And that is why there is the need to transform what Ramakrishna called the unripe eye into ripe eye. That is, as long as my eye is attached to perishable entities, it's unripe. As long as my eye is attached to the body and mind, both perishable, both constantly changing, it's still unripe. A ripe eye would be attaching the eye to something that's non-perishable. And therefore, the ego that I'm a child of God, I'm a devotee of God, or I'm the spirit. Now that would be a ripe ego. I mean, there is still the I. When you say I am the Atman, well, there is still the I there. I mean, it is kind of an ego, but it's an ego that is attached to the Atman, which itself is imperishable. And it's easy, relatively easy, to transcend the ripe I, but it's impossible to transcend the unripe I. There is the story of that Ramakrishna told about the bird sitting on the mast of a ship, how a bird sat on the mast of a ship and the ship set sail, and the bird was asleep, and then discovered later on when the bird woke up, there's just water everywhere. He just wanted to go to the land. And so when we read in his life that the bird flew all the way to the east for a long time, no sign of land, and its wings got tired. It came back, sat again on the mast, then tried west, south, north, all the directions. There was no land anywhere. And just then sat on the mast of the ship, just saying, well, this is my only refuge. This is the only place I can be safe because my wings are tired now. And then, of course, eventually the ship then moves and then eventually enters a port, reaches land, and then this bird is able to find the place. Same way, all of the spiritual practices that we do, all of the things like I must pray, I must meditate, I must do, are good. But the texts say that all of these things we do with the sense of I is primarily to tire our wings. Just keep on trying, it's almost like knocking your head against a stone wall. And after some time you realize, well, now it's not going to work. I cannot do it. Only when we experience this real, complete helplessness, we realize how fragile our resources are, how limited our resources are, and how far the journey is, then will true surrender come. But as long as a little sense of I is there, the surrender won't come. We need to evolve into the kind of spiritual seeker that Nachiketa in Kathopanishad was. That is a deep sense of Shraddha, a deep sense of faith within us. When surrender becomes natural, after our wings are tired, like that of the bird, we will see that the idea of the self itself will evolve. We then discover that these two terms, self-reliance and self-effort, may not be what they seem to be at first glance. We see both self-reliance and self-effort both have the word self in it. So our understanding of these terms will depend on our understanding of the term self. Now, as I said before, at present, all of the things that we do and think are really done either by the body and mind. All of our activities. Without the body and mind, we wouldn't be able to do them. But they are not the real I. So when we say self-reliance, what we really mean is reliance on the power and abilities of our body and mind. But the body and mind, according to Vedanta, are not the real me. So self-effort or self-reliance, although it is understood to be relying on oneself, it is not the real self. And therefore, odd as it may sound, self-reliance is really dependence on things other than who I am. So it's contradictory. So a deeper look at self-reliance shows us it really is not self-reliance, it's relying on things which are not me. On the other hand, if you look at self-surrender to God or self-surrender to a spiritual ideal, now that involves letting go of all fragile, perishable material supports and relying on one's own true self. Because the divine, the spirit, that's who is the real me. So surrendering to God in Vedantic terms really means surrendering to one's own true self. And I cannot hold to the true self unless I let go of all these pretend selves, all these selves who are pretending to be me. And that would be then a real independence. So here we are, a kind of a contradiction. Self-reliance or self-effort is really dependence. And self-surrender is really an act of complete independence, because we are surrendering everything who we are not and holding on to who we really are. So both self-reliance and self-effort are needed. Now, done properly, both can improve our understanding of the self. Now, self-reliance, therefore, understood in a proper way, can lead to self-surrender, which ultimately will lead to total freedom and independence. And then we understand the meaning of this, a perplexing statement, if you like, at first glance, when Vivekananda said, God helps those who do not help themselves. And think about it. Think about the word self and think about the word God, and we will see that our superficial understanding of self-effort and self-surrender need to give way for a deeper understanding of the terms. And then we will see how they mean very different when we look at them very deeply. Om Jananim Saratam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. Next Sunday, we will have Antar Yoga, as we do every month. We will have spiritual readings by two of the members, a lot of music, brief reflection, and along with that, a birthday celebration of everyone born in the month of June. Anyone here? June? One? Only one? Well, I hope next Sunday we'll have a lot more June birthdays. So any of your friends or family members who are born in June, even if they don't come to the Vedanta Center on other days, at least next Sunday they can come. And on Wednesday, we will continue with the study of the Gita. We are studying chapter 18 at present. And on Tuesday and Saturday, our Arati and meditation will also continue as usual. You're welcome for all of these programs. Let's conclude now with the prayer. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.